Hello and welcome back, Sleepy Historian here. Tonight, I want you to settle in, take a deep breath, and maybe pull the blanket a little closer around your shoulders, because we're about to drift into a story that is cold to the bone. A story of nights so bitter that frost climbed the inside of windows, and fog turned every street into a stage of ghosts. Now, before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it there? Are you in a warm bed, maybe with a cup of tea nearby, or are you lying awake, the world outside your window completely still? I love reading your answers. They make this late-night journey feel like we're all in the same quiet tavern of history together. Because tonight, we're walking into Victorian London, a place of contradictions, velvet parlours and glittering theatres on one side, and damp alleys full of the half-forgotten on the other. The winter of the city was merciless, coal was expensive, beds were scarce, and when the Thames froze, so too did the hopes of thousands who had nowhere else to go. But here's the twist. People didn't just freeze because of poverty or cold winds alone. They froze on gin and opium, cheap, intoxicating, numbing, a bitter medicine that promised warmth but quietly pulled its victims deeper into the snowdrift of oblivion. So, fluff your pillows, dim the lights, and let's step into this world together. Imagine it's the winter of 1860. The sun has gone down, though it was never much of a sun to begin with. Just a pale, watery disk struggling behind clouds. Fog presses low, thick and yellow with coal smoke. The street lamps glow like dying embers. You walk past a gin palace, its doors swinging open with bursts of laughter, cheap piano music and the sweet, sharp smell of juniper spirits. Inside, the poor find momentary warmth for a penny glass of gin. Outside, the night presses down colder than iron. Across the street, an apothecary sells little brown bottles of laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol. Mothers buy it to quiet crying babies, dock workers to soothe aching backs, and the desperate to forget hunger. A few drops, they say, and you can float above the misery. A few spoonfuls, and you might not feel the cold at all. And that's the trap. Gin heats the body only for a moment, before it steals what little warmth you had. Opium lulls you into a heavy sleep, where snowflakes gather silently on your coat. Together, they were the Victorian winter's deadliest lullaby. Picture the scene. A constable making his midnight rounds along a narrow lane in Whitechapel. His lantern sways, casting soft yellow halos onto the snow-dusted cobblestones. And there, in a doorway, he finds a figure slumped against the wall. At first, it looks like just another drunk who drank too deep of the gin bottle. But when the light falls across the man's face, the lips are blue, the eyes glassed over, and the breath completely gone. The newspapers of the day had a cruel way of reporting these deaths. They wrote of gin corpses, as if the frozen bodies were more spectacle than tragedy. Inquests would often note the same words again and again. Cause of death, exposure, accelerated by intoxication, which is a delicate Victorian way of saying they froze to death because they were too drunk or too drugged to move. In the poorer parishes, the workhouses overflowed. Beds were rationed, blankets too thin to fight the cold. Men and women who were turned away into the night sought comfort where they could find it. A gin palace that stayed open until dawn, or a tiny vial of laudanum slipped into a coat pocket. One case in 1873 told of a seamstress who left her workshop late at night. She was underfed, exhausted, and carrying half a bottle of cheap gin. When her body was found the next morning, lying against a frosted fence, she still clutched the glass neck of the bottle. The coroner wrote that she had likely sat down for a moment's rest, her senses dulled by liquor until the frost quietly overcame her. Another man, a dock labourer, was found collapsed outside the very gin shop where he had bought his last drink. The irony wasn't lost on the press. They called it a death of his own making, ignoring that his wage barely covered bread, and warmth came only in liquid form. And in darker corners, opium played its part. Laudanum didn't stir you into a staggering walk, but instead pulled you into heavy, dream-soaked sleep. The addict who drank too much before lying down on a bench or on the cobblestones often never woke again. Some were found with faint smiles, as if their last dream had been warmer than the world they left behind. Step with me now through the swinging doors of a Victorian gin palace. The moment you enter, the night vanishes. Frosted breath turns back into air, and the sting of wind on your face is replaced by the sharp perfume of juniper. Glasses clink. Laughter bursts too loud, too desperate, as if to drown out the knowledge that outside the snow is piling higher. The interior glitters almost like a church. Gin palaces were deliberately built to dazzle. Polished mirrors reflecting rows of bottles, chandeliers casting their golden glow, and mahogany counters carved with ornate detail. The poor and the desperate stood shoulder to shoulder with clerks, laundresses, sailors, even the occasional gentleman slumming among them. For the price of a penny, you could hold a glass of burning warmth between your hands. But this was no true sanctuary. The gin did not warm. It only tricked the blood into rushing to the skin, giving a fleeting flush of heat while lowering the body's core temperature. Patrons staggered back into the street after their fill, cheeks red, hearts racing, convinced they could brave the cold. In truth, they were walking out into their own silent funeral. And yet, in that moment inside, life burned bright. A group of washerwomen laughed too loudly, scarves pulled tight, clutching their gin like treasure. A sailor sang a half-forgotten shanty, voice cracking over the crowd. Somewhere in the corner, a woman poured laudanum into her drink, the bitter tincture mixing invisibly with the clear spirit, her eyelids already heavy with surrender. The contrast was brutal. Step outside again, and the streets looked like a stage after the play had ended. Dark, empty, haunted by echoes. A man collapsed against a wall might still have the warmth of gin in his chest, but the frost was claiming his fingers, stiffening his breath. By morning, another body carted away, another inquest that would blame intemperance rather than poverty, and London carried on. The theatres opened, the carriages rolled, the gas lamps glowed. Inside the palace, laughter, music, and illusion. Outside, silence, snow, and the thin veil of death. By the mid-19th century, every frozen body discovered on the streets of London became more than a tragedy. It became a headline. Victorian newspapers had a taste for drama, and they framed these deaths as cautionary tales, little morality plays meant to frighten readers into sobriety. One paper described a man who succumbed to gin and frost as if both were co-conspirators in his demise. Another spoke of women lulled by laudanum into eternal slumber against the stones of the city. These phrases weren't written with sympathy, they were written with judgment. The poor were scolded even in death. Moral reformers, preachers, doctors, even politicians, pounced on these stories. They argued that gin was the devil's ally, that opium was a poison of the soul, and that every corpse in the snow was evidence of sin, not of poverty. Sermons thundered against the wages of intemperance, painting the dead as examples rather than victims. In reality, gin and opium were not luxuries. They were the cheapest escape money could buy. For a labourer earning pennies, a fire was too expensive, but a dram of gin was possible. For a mother with 3 children crying from hunger, laudanum was cheaper than bread. These substances dulled pain, hunger, grief, while quietly opening the door to hypothermia. Politicians saw opportunity too. Public campaigns for temperance grew louder every winter, using the corpses of the poor to argue for restrictions, for new licensing laws, for greater control. The temperance lectures often described gin palaces as cathedrals of damnation, where souls were lost as quickly as shillings. But here lies the paradox. The same society that condemned drink and opium profited from them. Taxes on spirits lined the government's coffers. Apothecaries thrived on selling laudanum to every class. Doctors prescribed opium tinctures as casually as modern physicians might prescribe aspirin. And the poor, caught between survival and condemnation, froze silently in the shadows of a city that judged them for the very means they used to endure it. So each winter became a theatre of hypocrisy. The cold killed, the streets filled with frozen silhouettes, and yet the blame was placed not on the frost or on the hunger or on the failing safety nets of Victorian society, but on the bottle and the vial. The winter of 1860 to 1861 was remembered by Londoners as one of the bitterest in living memory. The Thames itself carried sheets of ice, barges slowed to a crawl, and the fog turned into a freezing mist that clung to every surface like glass. Inside the poorest homes, families gathered together in a single room, sometimes 6 or 7 souls pressed into one bed. A single coal fire, if they could afford it, glowed dimly in the grate. Most could not. Children slept in their coats, breath steaming into the dark, while parents whispered prayers that the morning would come before the cold claimed another life. In the rookeries, those overcrowded, crumbling tenements, blankets were shared and walls dripped with condensation that froze into delicate lace patterns by dawn. Imagine waking to see frost climbing not outside your window, but along the inside walls, as if winter had invaded your very bed. The streets told their own tale. At Covent Garden, a costermonger was found frozen beside his cart, hands still wrapped around the reins of his donkey. In Holborn, a child huddled against her mother's skirts, both unmoving, discovered stiff with cold by a milkman on his rounds. In Southwark, an entire family of 4 was carried to the parish morgue after the embers in their grate went out overnight. And all across the city, the familiar companions of this silent killer, gin and opium, left their trace. Empty bottles in frozen hands, small brown vials beside still bodies. The coroner's notes again and again. Exposure accelerated by intoxication. Winter was more than a season. It was an executioner. Every gust of wind was a lash, every flake of snow a warning, and yet London carried on as if nothing was unusual. Carriages rattled through the frosty mornings. Theatres announced their Christmas plays. Society ladies swept into balls dressed in silk and velvet. Meanwhile, in alleyways just a few streets away, men and women lay as silent statues, claimed by a cold that cared nothing for class or circumstance. To be poor in such a winter was to live with constant dread, not of thieves, not of disease, not even of hunger alone, but of the slow, creeping cold that could take you in your sleep, especially if your belly burned with gin, or your mind drifted on opium dreams. When the cold pressed hardest, the poor of Victorian London became inventive, though not always wisely so. Survival was rarely about comfort. It was about finding any way to endure one more night. Gin, for many, became a form of shared currency. Families who had no food pooled their pennies for a single bottle. Bread could fill the stomach, yes, but gin set fire to the blood, even if only for a moment. It was common to see a group of labourers passing the bottle between them, huddled together in an alleyway, toasting not to joy but to survival. Opium, too, was rationed and shared. Laudanum could quiet a child crying from cold and hunger, could lull a mother into a sleep deep enough to forget her shivering. But it was a dangerous gamble. More than one child never woke, their tiny bodies unable to handle the dosage meant for adults, and more than one parent drifted into a stupor so deep that the frost crept in unnoticed until the morning brought silence. Others sought warmth in unlikely places. Some slipped into stables, curling against horses for body heat, the animals' breath steaming into the dark. There are records of entire families bedding down in market stalls, burying themselves beneath sacks of produce, as if a pile of onions could be a quilt. For those who had truly nothing, even prison seemed better than the streets. Men would deliberately commit petty crimes, stealing a loaf, breaking a window, simply to be arrested. A night in a cold cell with a coarse blanket was preferable to freezing under the open sky. The police knew this pattern well, and often turned a blind eye to the winter criminals, whose true offence was poverty. And then there were the public houses and markets, crowded beyond reason on winter nights. People packed themselves in not only for drink, but for heat. The press of bodies, the sweat, the exhaled warmth. It created a kind of communal furnace. To step outside after hours of that heat was deadly. The body, flushed and sweating from gin and closeness, collapsed quickly once the cold reclaimed it. Every tactic was a wager, a gamble between warmth tonight and survival tomorrow. For many, it was a gamble they lost. The Victorian coroner's reports are, in their own way, a kind of grim bedtime storybook. Each entry is short, factual, stripped of emotion, yet behind every line lies a life lived and a final night endured. One such entry tells of a woman named Mary Ann, a laundress in her 30s. She was discovered one January morning in 1867, lying beside the steps of a parish church. In her hand, a corked bottle of laudanum, still half full. Witnesses testified she had been seen hours earlier, singing softly to herself outside a gin palace, her voice slurred, her shawl pulled tight. The coroner's note reads simply, "Exposure under the influence of spirituous liquors." But in that clinical phrase, you can almost imagine her drifting between song and silence until the frost hushed her forever. Another record from 1879 describes Thomas Green, a dock worker. After a long day unloading ships on the frozen Thames, he spent his pay on gin to warm himself, as the testimony went. His landlady remembered him leaving the gin shop, weaving slightly, his cheeks bright from drink. By dawn he was found in an alley, face turned toward the wall, his hands stiff as if still clutching something invisible. And then there is the story of a child, unnamed in the coroner's book, described only as female, approximately 5 years old. She was discovered beside her mother, both dead, their bodies huddled together beneath a thin blanket near Holborn. On the ground, a tiny vial of laudanum was found. Neighbours speculated the mother had given it to soothe the child into sleep, never knowing that both would drift too deeply into the final sleep of frost. These stories circulated in the newspapers with morbid fascination. Readers were reminded again and again, gin was the destroyer, opium the seducer, winter the executioner. Yet behind the rhetoric, what shines through is not sin or weakness, it is exhaustion. Exhaustion from poverty, from endless labour, from the cold that gnawed through every seam of Victorian life. If you listen closely, these aren't just statistics. They are whispers of people who lived on the edge of survival, who gambled with gin and opium because they had nothing else to bargain with. Their lives were brief, their deaths quiet, their memory preserved only in a few lines of faded ink. The Victorians were a people obsessed with morality, but they were also, in their own way, deeply concerned with charity. Each winter, as the death toll rose, London's newspapers filled with appeals for donations to the poor. Sermons thundered about Christian duty, and a handful of well-meaning reformers tried to weave a safety net where society had left only holes. Soup kitchens appeared across the city, ladling out thin broth and hunks of bread to lines of the desperate. It was no feast, but it was warmth, a reason to stand shoulder to shoulder in the glow of steaming pots. For many, a bowl of soup was the only hot thing to pass their lips in days. Charitable shelters opened their doors, but space was always scarce. Rows of straw mattresses filled church basements and parish halls. A blanket, shared with a stranger, became salvation. But turn just one person away, and the frost outside could become a death sentence. The charities knew this, and yet every night they closed their doors long before the crowds had thinned. Some organisations tried a different approach. Temperance shelters. Warmth, food and a bed were offered, on one condition: no gin, no opium. Those who staggered to the door reeking of spirits were often refused. Reformers believed they were saving lives by demanding sobriety, but in truth, many froze on the very steps of these houses of mercy. The state too played its part, though clumsily. The workhouses were meant to be the last resort, offering a bed and a bowl of porridge, but they were feared almost as much as the cold. Families were separated, the labour harsh, the stigma crushing. For many, a gin-soaked alleyway felt more merciful than the iron discipline of the workhouse. And still, despite all the sermons, the soup ladles and the straw mattresses, the numbers did not stop. Each winter, the morgues filled again. The newspapers printed their cautionary tales again. And the cycle of frost and intoxication repeated, as predictable as the seasons themselves. It is tempting to see Victorian charity as a warm quilt stretched across a freezing city. In truth, it was more like a thin shawl, covering some shoulders while leaving countless others exposed to the wind. Victorian London was not only a city of factories and fog, but also a city of words and stories. Tragedies that unfolded on frozen streets didn't stay confined to coroners' ledgers. They seeped into literature, song, and popular imagination. Charles Dickens, perhaps the era's keenest observer of poverty, painted countless winter scenes where cold and hunger stalked the poor like invisible wolves. In Our Mutual Friend, the River Thames itself becomes a character, dark, icy, swallowing the desperate. Though Dickens rarely mentioned gin or opium directly, his readers knew the subtext. Substances that blurred suffering, that left bodies vulnerable to frost, haunted every slum he described. Street ballads told the tales more bluntly. Vendors sold cheap broadsides on corners, their verses half song, half warning. He drank his gin, he lay him down, the frost it claimed him where he drowned. No bed, no fire, no kindly light. Gin was his blanket on that night. Children sang these refrains while skipping rope, turning human tragedy into playground rhyme. The theatres too played their part. Melodramas showed fallen women clutching laudanum bottles, their doom sealed by vice and cold. Audiences wept, not always for the characters, but for the mirror these plays held up to reality. And yet, they left the theatre warmed by gaslight, returning to homes with fireplaces glowing, while outside, the same stories repeated silently. Even visual art caught the theme. Illustrations in Punch magazine showed caricatures of drunkards collapsed in the snow, exaggerated for humour, the cruelty disguised as satire. Other engravings, more solemn, depicted mothers shielding infants with their bodies, frost glittering on their hair. In every form, the message was tangled, a blend of pity, mockery, and moral judgment. The poor who froze were memorialized, but rarely humanized. Their suffering became metaphor, warning, or entertainment, but seldom justice. And so, the cultural imagination of Victorian Britain wrapped gin, opium, and frost into a single story, a cautionary tale of weakness and vice. Yet, if you listen closely, beneath the satire and the sermons, you can still hear the whisper of real lives, brief sparks of warmth extinguished too soon. As the 19th century moved toward its close, London modernized. Gas lamps gave way to electric bulbs, new laws tightened the sale of spirits, and medical science began to question the casual flooding of society with opium. But the old pattern, the winter deaths, never truly vanished. Poverty had simply changed its costume. Gin and laudanum never stopped being companions of the desperate. They were joined later by morphine and chloral, and then by other, more modern forms of chemical escape. But the story remained the same, people numbing themselves against hardship, while society looked on with a mixture of pity, judgment, and indifference. What makes the Victorian tale so haunting is not only the bodies found frozen on the streets, but the ease with which they were forgotten. Each winter was treated as an isolated tragedy, a cold spell, a seasonal hardship. Rarely was it admitted that the true frost lay in the structures of society, the cost of coal, the wages of labour, the scarcity of beds. And yet, within that bleak history lies a lesson that feels as true now as it did then. Warmth is not only fire and blankets, but also compassion. A city can be glittering with chandeliers and still be frozen at its heart if it allows its poorest to die unseen. For the Victorians, gin and opium were not simply vices. They were shields, fragile and fatal, raised against a cold that seemed larger than any one person could endure. They were desperate bargains, struck in alleyways and gin palaces, gambles for one more night of comfort, even if the morning never came. And so, when we look back at those winters, the frozen bodies carried away at dawn, the bottles still clutched in stiff hands, the thin shawls drawn over lifeless shoulders, we are not just reading about Victorian London. We are reading about the universal struggle of human beings who will do anything to feel a little less pain, a little less hunger, a little less cold. That is their legacy, written not in monuments or marble, but in frost and silence. And so, our walk through the frozen streets of Victorian London comes to an end. The gas lamps flicker low, the last gin palaces close their doors, and the city grows quiet beneath its blanket of snow. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The crunch of boots on icy cobblestones, the soft hiss of fog against the lamplight, the distant murmur of laughter fading into silence. You can almost feel the cold pressing against your skin, Only now you are safe, wrapped warm, listening in the dark. The people we've met tonight are long gone. The laundress with her half-empty vial of laudanum, the dock worker with gin on his breath, the nameless child asleep against her mother's arms. Their stories linger like faint footprints in the snow, washed away by time but never truly lost. History often remembers battles, kings, and grand inventions, but sometimes the truest stories lie in the quiet corners, the frost-bitten doorways, the bottles on cobblestones, the silence of a city that slept while its poorest froze. These are not just tales of death, but whispers of endurance, of fleeting warmth, of people who faced the winter with nothing but fragile shields of gin and opium. And now, as you lie here listening, perhaps ready to drift into sleep yourself, let the story fold itself gently around you. The past is cold, but your present is warm. The frost cannot reach you here. Breathe slowly, close your eyes. Let the sounds of Victorian London fade into the distance. Gas lamps dimming, footsteps softening, snow falling endlessly on empty streets. You are safe, you are warm, and history for tonight will keep watch as you sleep. Tonight, we drift into Paris. Paris of the 1920s, the city everyone thought they knew. The city of shimmering lights, of champagne bubbles rising in gilded glasses, of jazz melodies slinking out of smoky basements where American trumpets met French saxophones, and of lovers strolling arm in arm along the Seine. But there was another Paris, a slower, darker, more velvet-covered Paris, hidden behind the silk curtains of Montmartre cabarets, in the shadowed corners of left-bank apartments, and even in the polished salons of the very rich. It was a Paris intoxicated, not just with love or art or freedom, but with heroin. Yes, heroin. The little white powder that arrived like a whisper, promising clarity, calm, courage. At first, it was a modern medicine, something respectable doctors praised for quieting coughs, soothing nerves, even sharpening the mind. But by the 1920s, it had slipped its medical disguise and was drifting across the veins of the city like perfume, seducing writers, dancers, businessmen, aristocrats, and street performers alike. And so tonight, as you settle back into your pillow, or let your blanket fold around you like the soft darkness of a Parisian jazz club, I invite you to wander slowly with me. We'll move through the streets of this strange Paris, the Paris of heroin. A Paris of glittering decadence and whispered ruin, where addiction was as fashionable as a new hat, and where entire nights disappeared in a haze of powder. So tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Which city, which country, and what hour of the night is keeping you awake? And if you're listening in bed, drifting towards sleep, consider subscribing, so the next time we journey through history, you'll already have a seat waiting. Now, let us begin. Heroin did not begin as a scandal. It began, like so many modern vices, as a miracle. At the turn of the 20th century, the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer proudly released their newest discovery, a smooth, crystalline white powder, more refined than morphine, more controllable than opium. They called it heroin, from the German word heroisch, heroic, a drug that would make you feel strong, invincible, untouchable. Doctors prescribed it for coughing fits, asthma, even for children struggling with restless nights. Housewives sprinkled it into their teas, soldiers returning from the Great War found it in their prescriptions, and chemists displayed it proudly beside aspirin. No one yet whispered the word addiction, but Paris was a city that always knew how to turn a substance into a fashion. By the 1920s, after the Great War had left wounds both visible and hidden, heroin found its new stage. Jazz musicians found it sharpened their music, poets found it opened strange doors of thought, and those scarred by the trenches found it dulled the memories they could not forget. And so, in the smoky bars of Montparnasse, between the strokes of Picasso's paintbrush and the reckless prose of Hemingway's typewriter, heroin began to flow, not as a medicine, but as an enchantment. By the middle of the 1920s, heroin was no longer confined to pharmacies or whispered remedies. It had stepped onto the boulevards of Paris with the same elegance as a woman in silk gloves and pearls. In Montmartre, cabaret singers let their voices glide softer, more dreamlike, after a discreet pinch of powder. In Montparnasse, where the American expatriates gathered, writers, painters, drifters, the little packets of heroin passed like cigarettes, slipped into the night along with bottles of wine and murmured confessions. The wealthy loved it not because they needed it, but because it was forbidden. It was a symbol, a token of belonging to a hidden society. A guest at a salon might arrive with champagne in one hand and just as casually offer a small glass vial filled with white powder. For the nerves, they would say, or, with a smile that revealed a little too much, for inspiration. The dancers of the Folies Bergères whispered that heroin kept their movements light, their bodies tireless, their fears silenced beneath the glare of the stage lights. Meanwhile, aristocrats, already bored with champagne, absinthe and cocaine, welcomed heroin as the next great indulgence. To refuse it was almost impolite, like refusing a toast. Yet the fashion was not loud. Unlike the noisy gin palaces of London or the bright speakeasies of New York, Parisian heroin was discreet. It was not taken at bars with cheers and clinking glasses, but in velvet-draped apartments, in corners of smoky jazz clubs, or at the back tables of cafes where poets argued about art and eternity. It was chic precisely because it was whispered. Heroin was not the drug of the masses, it was the drug of the few, the drug of the secret, the drug that made you feel chosen, elevated, removed from the ordinary dust of the world. And yet, beneath the glamour, Paris was already paying the price. Behind the polished mirrors of boudoir and the laughter of salons, bodies began to falter. Skin grew pale, lips dry, nights restless. But in the moment, all of that could be hidden under powder, perfume and charm. Heroin was no longer just a medicine, it was a costume Paris wore with pride, even as it began to eat away at the flesh beneath. Paris in the 1920s did not sleep, or rather, it dreamed with its eyes open. In the basements of Montparnasse and Pigalle, the air was thick with saxophone notes, cigarette smoke, and the low laughter of people who didn't want the night to end. American musicians, many of them black veterans of the Great War, had brought jazz across the Atlantic, and with them came a new rhythm, a pulse that Paris seized like a heartbeat of its own. But in the shadows, beyond the dancing shoes and tilted hats, another pulse was beating, quieter, slower, and far more dangerous. Heroin had found its way into the bloodstream of Parisian nightlife. At first, it was discreet. A musician might step outside for a moment, return with eyes slightly unfocused but fingers moving across the keys like liquid gold. A dancer might excuse herself, only to come back with movements that seemed lighter than air. Soon, though, it was no secret. Small glass vials appeared on cafe tables beside the wine bottles. Rolled-up notes disappeared briefly behind curtains, and spoons glinted under candlelight. For some, heroin was fuel. Writers claimed it sharpened their ideas, stripped away the dullness of ordinary thought, and carried them into a world where words came like thunder. Painters swore it let them see colours that no sober eye could catch. Musicians whispered that it made their instruments sing with voices not their own. For others, it was refuge. Soldiers scarred by trench warfare found it dulled the ghosts of gunfire and mud. Widows found it softened the loneliness of nights that stretched endlessly, and the young, restless, uncertain of their place in a changing world, found that heroin offered the simplest escape of all, from themselves. And so the jazz clubs of Paris became something more than places of music. They were temples in their own strange way. Temples where the worship was not of God, nor of reason, but of forgetting. Forgetting pain, forgetting hunger, forgetting the weight of living after a war that had shattered so much. The heroin craze was never shouted, never openly advertised. It whispered its way into every corner, like the faint smoke of a candle burning down. Paris danced, Paris sang, Paris laughed, and behind every laugh, behind every dance step, behind every trumpet note, heroin was watching. It would be easy to imagine heroin as something used only by the poor or by desperate outcasts hiding in alleyways. But in Paris, the faces of heroin were far more surprising. There was the aristocratic woman in pearls and fur who carried a silver snuff box, not of tobacco but of powder. which she would delicately press to her nose between glasses of champagne. There was the struggling poet in a tattered coat, who believed the drug gave him visions of eternity, even as it left him unable to afford food. There was the cabaret singer, adored on stage, whose voice trembled with beauty at night, and whose body trembled with need by morning. Doctors too played their part. Some prescribed heroin with casual ease, still convinced of its therapeutic value. Others secretly hooked themselves, dosing late into the night after treating their patients by day. And then there were the dealers, well-dressed men who moved through salons and cafes like any other gentleman, except that the pockets of their coats rattled softly with vials and packets instead of coins. Addiction did not discriminate. It draped itself across silk and rags alike, across the trembling hands of a painter and the steady hands of a banker, across the smoky breath of a prostitute and the perfumed sighs of an heiress. The city itself seemed to wear heroin like a mask of glamour, brilliance and courage, but beneath it the face of Paris was growing pale, restless and sick. By the late 1920s, heroin was no longer only a private indulgence of Parisian elites, it had become a public problem. Not that the city liked to admit it. Paris preferred its scandals to be romantic, tinged with poetry or love affairs, not with pale bodies and trembling hands. But slowly, stories began to drift into newspapers. A young singer collapsing on stage, her voice stolen by something no one dared name. A painter found lifeless in his studio, his last canvas unfinished, a vial of white powder lying open beside the brushes. A wealthy heir disappearing from fashionable soirees, seen instead wandering the streets with clothes unbuttoned and eyes hollow. Doctors, once enthusiastic promoters of the heroic drug, now spoke in whispers of its dangers. The French press, cautious but curious, began to ask whether Paris was losing itself not to foreign invaders, but to something smaller, quieter, deadlier, and politicians, eager to appear concerned, introduced new restrictions. Pharmacies tightened their shelves, prescriptions were more carefully noted, and police raids flickered occasionally through the jazz clubs. Yet for every raid another dealer appeared. For every locked cabinet, another unlocked pocket opened. Paris was too enchanted, too unwilling to let go of its fashionable poison. The truth was simple. Heroin had woven itself into the very fabric of the city. To rip it out would mean tearing apart the nights, the music, the salons, the whispered confidences that had become as essential to Parisian life as bread or wine. And so the price was paid, not in francs, but in flesh. Those who surrendered themselves fully to the powder found their lives shrinking. The poet who once filled pages with wild, fevered visions could no longer write more than a few broken lines. The dancer who dazzled beneath stage lights stumbled in rehearsals, her body no longer obeying her. The aristocrat, once the heart of every salon, withdrew into shadows, her beauty fading into something brittle and haunted. Paris was still laughing, still dancing, still pretending. But behind every glamorous face there seemed to be another, hidden, pale, tired, trembling, lost. Addiction was not loud. It was slow. It did not crash through doors or burn down houses. It simply took away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the craving. And in the hushed hours before dawn, when the music had stopped and the wine bottles were empty, Paris began to feel the emptiness too. Yet even then, even as warnings spread, heroin carried with it a strange allure. It was not only destruction, it was seduction. To some, the danger made it even more desirable, like a forbidden love, like a kiss you knew would ruin you, and yet leaned into anyway. By the close of the decade, Paris stood between two images of itself. On one side, the world-famous city of light, cafes crowded with laughter, artists painting futures, jazz spilling from every cellar, lovers kissing along the Seine. On the other side, the city of shadows, pale faces bent over spoons, trembling hands clutching vials, silent figures slumping in rented rooms. To walk through Paris was to see both worlds at once. A cabaret sparkling with music might hide behind its curtains 3 or 4 bodies stretched out on sofas, half asleep in chemical haze. A salon might roar with arguments about art and politics, while in the corner a young poet slipped away from the noise, chasing silence in powder. The city was alive and dying at the same time, vibrant and fading, brilliant and broken. And through it all, heroin flowed, whispering, seducing, erasing. Paris of the late 1920s was not only a city of heroin, it was a city of choices. Never before had there been so many ways to escape the ordinary weight of living. For those with money, champagne still flowed endlessly, every cork a promise of laughter. For those who preferred the thrill of illegality, American whiskey, smuggled in during Prohibition, appeared in smoky cellars and back rooms, its bottles hidden behind stacks of flour and crates of onions. Absinthe, though officially banned, still flickered like green fire in the glasses of stubborn devotees. Cocaine, powdered and quick, offered a sharper thrill, a rush of energy that seemed made for the frantic rhythm of jazz. And then there was heroin, quiet, secret, seductive. Unlike the noisy intoxication of alcohol or the manic brightness of cocaine, heroin was slow. It whispered rather than shouted. It promised not frenzy but peace. That was its power, and its curse. Dealers knew this well. They did not need to shout their wares in the street. They simply leaned close in the corner of a cafe, their pockets heavy with tiny glass vials, their eyes watchful. The city itself seemed to provide the perfect stage. Dimly lit clubs where shadows stretched long, where anything might be hidden in the folds of a coat or the clasp of a handbag. And the market only grew. Every war had its profiteers, and the war on nerves, memories and loneliness proved no different. Morphine and heroin factories across Europe quietly fed the demand, their exports travelling across borders disguised as medical goods. Paris received them eagerly, the city acting as both consumer and distributor, its veins mirroring the very veins of those who lived inside it. To live in Paris, then, was to walk among temptations. Every street corner seemed to hold a choice, a cafe filled with laughter, a cabaret pulsing with sound, or a dim stairwell leading upward to a small room, a candle, a vial, and silence. The history books often give us only numbers, addicts counted, seizures recorded, deaths noted in ledgers. But behind each number was a face, and Paris was full of them. There was the young pianist, once the darling of Montmartre. His hands flew across the keys with brilliance that made crowds fall silent. But heroin slowed his fingers, turned his music languid, until finally he could play no more. He was last seen wandering the banks of the Seine, humming broken notes to himself. There was the actress who dazzled in silent films, her beauty lighting up the screen. But as the years passed, her eyes dulled, her movements slowed, and her directors stopped calling. She retreated to an apartment heavy with curtains, where she lived only for the next dose, her mirror reflecting a ghost of the woman Paris had once adored. There was the soldier, scarred by the Great War, who could not sleep without the powder. His nightmares of mud, rats and shells were washed away only by heroin, and so he clung to it, even as it hollowed him from the inside. And there were countless others unnamed, forgotten. Street sweepers, shop girls, waiters, factory hands. Paris did not remember their stories, but the powder claimed them all the same. Addiction was not dramatic, it was quiet. A soft theft of life, so slow that often the victim did not realize what had been taken until it was too late. By 1929, the golden mask of Paris was beginning to crack. The stock markets trembled, fortunes evaporated, and with them the endless flow of champagne and luxury. Nightclubs still played their jazz, but the laughter seemed thinner. And in the quieter corners of the city, heroin's presence was harder to disguise. Police records grew thicker. Doctors admitted, at last, the dangers they had once ignored. Families whispered of sons and daughters lost to the drug, but rarely spoke it aloud, for shame was as heavy as grief. The heroin craze had seduced Paris, yes, but seduction always has a price, and the city was beginning to pay it. When the markets collapsed in 1929, Paris trembled like the rest of the world. The champagne fountains dried, the soirees grew fewer, and the cabarets that had once seemed untouchable now counted every guest carefully. The rich lost fortunes overnight, and the poor, already balancing on the edge, slid further into hunger and despair. Heroin did not disappear with the money. In fact, in some ways, it grew stronger. For the wealthy, it became less of a fashionable accessory and more of a private refuge. Those who could no longer afford to dazzle Paris with cars and gowns instead retreated into their apartments, clutching vials like old jewels. And for the working class, heroin spread in quieter, harsher ways, no longer wrapped in velvet and pearls, but hidden in matchboxes, traded in alleys, shared between trembling hands. The city that once danced with heroin now shivered with it. No longer chic, no longer whispered with a sly smile at salons. It had become survival, a way to silence the ache of an empty stomach, to dull the weight of unemployment, to make the long nights of fear a little shorter. The jazz still played, but its sound had changed. What had once been exuberant, carefree, and defiant was now more melancholic, softer, a sound of longing rather than triumph. The horns still rose, the drums still beat, but the rhythm carried sadness in its bones. And heroin drifted with that music, not as a glamorous partner, but as a shadow, one that crept into every quarter, from the gilded apartments of the right bank to the narrow, hungry streets of Belleville. As the 1930s unfolded, heroin was no longer spoken of with fashionable daring. The French authorities, pressured by international treaties and by the growing recognition of the drug's destruction, tightened their laws. Pharmacies locked their cabinets, doctors risked their licenses, and police cracked down harder. But addiction has never obeyed laws. It went underground, where shadows were deep and records seldom kept. Addicts disappeared from the grand salons and instead gathered in dim boarding rooms, in abandoned warehouses, in corners of the city where even the police seldom lingered. The faces changed too. No longer the glittering aristocrat showing off a vial like a diamond, but gaunt figures with hollow cheeks, exchanging doses like bread. No longer the darling cabaret singer, but a chorus girl who sang with trembling lips, hoping the powder would hold her voice together for just one more night. Paris had always worn two masks, one of brilliance, one of sorrow. But by the mid-1930s the sorrow was heavier. The heroin craze that had once seduced the city had left it pale, bruised and trembling in silence. By the late 1930s, Paris could feel the tremors of another storm. The cafes still clattered with cups and saucers, the Seine still reflected the soft glow of lamplight, but beneath it all the city was uneasy. Germany was restless, politics were brittle, and everyone felt the air tightening like the pause before thunder. Heroin, once the hidden heartbeat of Parisian nights, had already begun to fade from the spotlight. Not because it was gone, but because something darker was coming. The authorities pushed harder against it. Raids, seizures, and arrests increased, and international treaties tightened the flow of supplies. Dealers grew more secretive, addicts more desperate, and yet heroin did not vanish. It lingered in the veins of the city like an echo. Soldiers who had tasted morphine during the Great War sometimes sought heroin again, unable to face another march of drums and orders without it. Artists who feared the collapse of their world leaned back into the powder, hoping it would at least soften the edge of dread. Paris was caught between two poisons, the white powder in its veins and the black cloud gathering at it. When the Second World War erupted, heroin did not disappear. It transformed. The city under occupation lived in hunger, silence, and fear. The grand salons of the 1920s were closed, their chandeliers dark, their laughter long gone. Jazz was muted, censored, watched carefully by the eyes of occupiers. Heroin slipped into this silence like a ghost. It was no longer glamorous, no longer fashionable. It was survival for some, destruction for others. In the shadows of ration lines and curfews, addicts still sought it, dealers still traded it, and whispers of the drug followed soldiers and civilians alike. But heroin was no longer the darling of Paris. It was its secret shame. The elegant mask had been torn away. What remained was a reminder of wounds that never healed. The soldiers who could not forget the last war. The artists who could not find hope in the new one. The people who clung to forgetting because remembering was too heavy. When the war ended, Paris tried to rise again. The City of Light wanted to shine once more, to laugh in its cafes, to dance to jazz without fear, to kiss openly along the Seine, and so Paris forgot. It forgot the shadows of the occupation, it forgot the pale faces of addicts, and it forgot, deliberately, the heroin craze of the 1920s. History books spoke more of liberation than of addiction, more of triumph than of trembling veins, and Paris was happy to leave it that way. For to remember too closely would be to admit that the city, so proud, so brilliant, had once been seduced and hollowed out by a powder that arrived like perfume and lingered like poison. But if you listen closely, in the old songs, in the faded photographs, in the diaries hidden in attics, you can still hear it. The faint rhythm of a trumpet played too slowly, the rustle of silk curtains in a Montmartre apartment, the clink of a silver vial on a marble tabletop. The heroin craze never truly vanished. It was simply buried beneath layers of history, waiting for someone, one quiet night, to lift the curtain again. Even though Paris tried to bury the memory of its heroin years, the traces lingered, in brushstrokes, in pages, in melodies. Some of the literature of the era, though never naming the drug outright, carries its fingerprints. Poems that drift without direction, prose that circles around absence, paintings that seem blurred at the edges, as if the world itself were dissolving. These were not accidents. They were whispers of a city breathing powder. The jazz that once pulsed with restless joy now sometimes softened into melancholy, its notes stretched and trembling, as though echoing the veins of the musicians who played them. Even fashion, with its fascination for pale faces, tired eyes, and fragile elegance, seemed touched by the ghost of heroin's effect. The look of languid decadence became chic, without anyone saying why. Paris was always a city of masks, but behind its glamour there is always shadow, and for a brief, dangerous decade, that shadow took the form of heroin. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that history is not always written in wars and revolutions. Sometimes it is written in whispers, in quiet habits, in the trembling of a hand reaching for a vial in the dark. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris was just such a history, soft, hidden, seductive. It was a story of a city already wounded by war, eager for escape, dazzled by art, and undone by temptation. A city that laughed even as it trembled, that danced even as it fell, that pretended to shine even as it dimmed. And though the world moved on, though Paris rebuilt, though heroin was pushed back into the shadows, the story remains. It remains in the silence between jazz notes, in the faded glamour of old photographs, in the fragile beauty of memories that were never meant to last. So let your eyes close now. Let the lights of Paris, bright and dim, drift away like a city seen from a train window at night. Let the music soften, let the whispers fade, let the powder settle into silence. History, like sleep, is always waiting, and tonight you have walked through both. Hello, dear listeners. In today's episode, we're taking another journey back into the forgotten folds of history, searching for the quiet moments that shaped the world. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from by leaving a comment below. Are you just waking up or about to drift off? If you find yourself enjoying these calm passages through time, please consider subscribing. And of course, like this video if you like it. There are many more nights like this ahead. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about Victorian respectability. Behind the pristine image of proper ladies managing their households and attending tea parties, an epidemic was quietly claiming lives across drawing rooms throughout England and America. These women weren't criminals or outcasts. They were mothers, wives, daughters, and pillars of society who became unwitting victims of their era's most dangerous miracle cure. In this series, I'm going to take you deep into the hidden world of Victorian opium addiction, where the line between medicine and poison blurred beyond recognition. We'll uncover the heartbreaking stories of real women whose names were whispered in hushed tones, and whose mysterious deaths were explained away as nervous conditions or weak constitutions. But first, let me show you just how devastating this silent epidemic truly was. Meet Charlotte Winslow, a woman whose story would become tragically common throughout the Victorian era. In 1853, Charlotte was everything society expected of a proper lady. She managed her husband's household in Boston with military precision, raised 3 children with unwavering devotion, and never missed a single charitable function. But behind closed doors, Charlotte was fighting a battle that would ultimately claim her life. It started innocently enough. After the difficult birth of her youngest daughter, Charlotte's physician prescribed laudanum for what he called her nervous exhaustion. Just a few drops in water, morning and evening, to calm her spirits and restore her strength. The amber liquid tasted bitter, but within minutes of taking it, Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest, washing away not just her physical pain, but every worry that had been gnawing at her mind. What Charlotte didn't know was that she had just taken her first dose of liquid opium, a substance so powerfully addictive that it would soon control every aspect of her existence. Within weeks, those prescribed doses no longer provided the same relief. Charlotte found herself taking the medicine 3 times a day, then 4, then whenever the familiar ache of withdrawal began to creep into her bones. The truly insidious part of this tragedy was how completely normalised laudanum had become in Victorian society. Walk into any apothecary shop in London or New York, and you'd find dozens of patent medicines containing opium. Godfrey's cordial for teething babies, Dover's powder for headaches, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, for everything from menstrual cramps to melancholy. These weren't hidden in back rooms or sold by shadowy dealers. They were displayed proudly on shop counters, advertised in respectable newspapers, and recommended by family physicians. For Victorian women, laudanum wasn't just medicine, it was salvation. In an era when women had virtually no control over their bodies or their lives, when they were expected to endure childbirth without complaint, manage households without help, and suppress every emotion except gentle contentment, laudanum offered something precious: escape. Just a few drops could transform a day of endless domestic duties into something bearable. It could quiet the screaming of colicky babies, ease the pain of another difficult pregnancy, and provide a brief respite from the crushing weight of societal expectations. But this escape came at a price that most women didn't discover until it was far too late. The same qualities that made laudanum so appealing also made it devastatingly addictive. The opium didn't just relieve pain, it rewired the brain's chemistry, creating a physical dependence that grew stronger with every dose. Women who had started taking laudanum for legitimate medical reasons soon found themselves unable to function without it. Consider the case of Margaret Thornfield, a minister's wife in rural Yorkshire. Margaret began taking laudanum after developing what her doctor called neuralgia, a catch-all term for unexplained pain that Victorian physicians often used when they couldn't identify a specific ailment. The medicine worked wonderfully at first. Margaret's mysterious aches disappeared, and she felt more energetic and capable than she had in years. She threw herself into her duties as a pastor's wife with renewed vigour, organising charity drives and visiting the sick with tireless enthusiasm. But as months passed, Margaret noticed troubling changes. The periods between doses became increasingly difficult to endure. She would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her heart racing with inexplicable panic. During the day, she found herself watching the clock obsessively, counting the hours until she could take her next dose. When she tried to reduce the amount, as her conscience occasionally demanded, she was struck by symptoms so severe she thought she was dying. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, her stomach would twist with nausea, and waves of despair would wash over her with such intensity that she could barely leave her bedroom. Margaret's husband, a kind but naive man who trusted completely in his wife's virtue and his physician's wisdom, never suspected that his wife's medicine was slowly destroying her. Like most people of his era, he believed that addiction was a moral failing that afflicted only the weak-willed and degenerate. The idea that his pious, devoted wife could become dependent on her prescribed medicine was simply unthinkable. This blindness to the reality of laudanum addiction wasn't unique to Margaret's husband. Victorian society had created an elaborate fiction around opium use that allowed respectable people to maintain their denial, even as the evidence mounted around them. When women began taking increasingly large doses of their medicines, it was attributed to worsening health conditions that required stronger treatment. When they became withdrawn and listless, it was blamed on feminine weakness or nervous disorders. When they died, suddenly and mysteriously, it was explained as heart failure or brain fever. The truth was far more sinister. These women weren't succumbing to mysterious illnesses, they were overdosing on opium, sometimes accidentally, as their tolerance increased and they lost track of how much they had taken, and sometimes deliberately, as the weight of their addiction became unbearable. But because laudanum deaths often mimicked natural causes, and because families were desperate to protect their reputations, the true scope of the epidemic remained hidden. Victorian medical knowledge of addiction was primitive at best. Doctors understood that opium could be habit-forming, but they vastly underestimated its power and assumed that respectable people would naturally limit their use through moral restraint. They failed to recognize that physical dependence could overcome even the strongest willpower, and they had no effective treatments for withdrawal. When patients complained of symptoms after reducing their laudanum dose, doctors often interpreted this as evidence that they still needed the medicine, inadvertently encouraging continued use. The isolation of Victorian women made the problem even worse. Unlike men who might encounter other opium users in smoking dens or through social networks, women took their laudanum in the privacy of their homes, often unaware that they weren't alone in their struggle. They had no way to compare their experiences or seek help from others who understood their predicament. Each woman believed her growing dependence was a personal failing, a secret shame that must be hidden at all costs. This shame was compounded by the era's rigid gender expectations. Victorian women were supposed to be moral guardians, pure and self-controlled beings who elevated their families through their virtue. The idea that they might be unable to control their use of medicine contradicted everything society believed about feminine nature. Women who recognized their dependence faced an impossible choice: admit their problem and risk social disgrace, or continue using laudanum and hope they could somehow regain control before it was too late. Most chose to continue in silence, creating elaborate deceptions to hide their increasing consumption. They would visit multiple apothecary shops to avoid suspicion, claim to be buying medicine for sick relatives, or send servants on errands to purchase laudanum from shops across town. Some became expert at diluting their husband's brandy with laudanum, creating a mixture that could be consumed openly without raising questions. Others hid bottles throughout their homes, ensuring they would never be caught without access to their medicine. The financial cost of maintaining a laudanum habit could be devastating. As tolerance increased, women needed larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same effect. What had started as a few pennies worth of medicine per week could eventually consume a significant portion of the household budget. Women would sell jewelry, pawn household items, or find creative ways to skim money from their domestic allowances to fund their purchases. Some even resorted to theft, taking coins from their husbands' pockets or their children's piggy banks when desperation overwhelmed their moral constraints. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the laudanum epidemic was how it robbed women of their relationships with their children. Mothers who had once been attentive and nurturing became distant and unpredictable under the influence of opium. They might be unnaturally cheerful and energetic shortly after taking their medicine, then irritable and withdrawn as the effects wore off. Children learned to read these mood cycles, approaching their mothers carefully during the good periods and avoiding them during the bad ones. Some mothers, recognizing the damage their addiction was causing, made desperate attempts to quit. They would pour their laudanum down the drain in moments of resolve, only to send servants rushing to the apothecary hours later when withdrawal symptoms became unbearable. Others tried to gradually reduce their doses, marking careful measurements on their bottles and setting strict schedules for consumption. But without medical support or understanding, these efforts almost invariably failed. The medical establishment's ignorance about addiction treatment meant that women who did seek help often received advice that made their situations worse. Doctors might recommend switching to different opium preparations, believing that variety would somehow reduce dependence. They prescribed additional drugs, like alcohol or chloral hydrate, to manage withdrawal symptoms, often creating new addictions alongside the original problem. Some physicians recommended complete rest cures, isolating women in private sanatoriums where they were given even more laudanum to keep them calm and compliant. The desperation of these women manifested in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Eleanor Hartwell, wife of a prominent London banker, began crushing her laudanum tablets and mixing them with her morning tea when liquid preparations no longer satisfied her cravings. She would sit at her mahogany breakfast table, surrounded by fine china and fresh flowers, consuming what amounted to lethal doses of opium while discussing the weather with her unsuspecting husband. Eleanor's transformation was gradual but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Her once rosy complexion became pale and waxy. Her eyes took on a glassy, distant quality, and her movements became languid and dreamlike. She would nod off during afternoon visits, her embroidery falling from limp fingers as she drifted into opium-induced stupors. When questioned about her health, she would smile serenely and speak of feeling wonderfully peaceful, as if she had discovered some secret to contentment that others couldn't understand. The servants in these grand households often became unwitting accomplices in their mistress's addictions. Mary O'Brien, Eleanor's lady's maid, later recalled how she was sent on increasingly frequent errands to different chemist shops across London. Mrs. Hartwell would claim she needed medicine for various ailments, a headache remedy for the cook, stomach soothers for visiting relatives, sleeping draughts for her nervous sister. Mary never questioned these requests, because questioning one's employer simply wasn't done. And besides, all the medicines seemed perfectly legitimate. What Mary didn't realise was that she was participating in an elaborate shell game designed to hide the true extent of Eleanor's consumption. By the height of her addiction, Eleanor was taking laudanum every 2 hours around the clock. She kept bottles hidden in her jewellery box, behind books in the library, even sewn into the lining of her winter coat. The woman who had once prided herself on running an impeccable household could no longer remember whether she had given instructions to the cook or paid the weekly bills. The social calendar that had once defined Eleanor's existence became a minefield of potential exposure. She would accept invitations to tea parties and charity events, then spend agonizing hours calculating when she could take her medicine without being observed. Sometimes she would excuse herself multiple times during a single afternoon visit, claiming feminine indisposition while she retreated to consume laudanum in the host's powder room. Other times she would arrive at social gatherings already heavily medicated, speaking too slowly and smiling too broadly while her friends exchanged worried glances. Victorian etiquette provided perfect cover for these behaviours, because polite society had developed elaborate codes for ignoring uncomfortable truths. When Eleanor began missing important social events or arriving in obviously altered states, her friends simply stopped mentioning it. They would speak around her condition, referring to her delicate constitution or her ongoing treatment for nervous exhaustion. This conspiracy of silence allowed the addiction to progress unchecked, while maintaining the fiction that everything was perfectly normal. The physical deterioration of laudanum addicts followed a predictable pattern that doctors of the era either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Women would lose significant amounts of weight as the opium suppressed their appetites, but this was often praised as fashionable thinness rather than recognized as a symptom of illness. Their skin would take on a yellowish pallor. Their teeth would begin to decay from the constant presence of sugar-laden patent medicines, and their hair would become brittle and lifeless. Yet these changes were often attributed to the natural effects of aging or the stresses of domestic life. Perhaps most tragically, the cognitive effects of chronic laudanum use robbed these women of their mental acuity just when they needed it most to recognize their predicament. The same drug that had initially sharpened their focus and elevated their mood began to cloud their judgment and impair their memory. They would forget conversations they had just finished, lose track of time for hours at a stretch, and make increasingly poor decisions about their medicine consumption. Victoria Ashworth, a clergyman's daughter from Bath, exemplified this tragic decline. Once known for her sharp wit and extensive knowledge of literature, Victoria began experiencing what she described as mental fog after months of laudanum use. She would start reading a book only to discover she had already read the same chapter 3 times without remembering it. During conversations, she would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at her companions while struggling to remember what she had been saying. Victoria's family attributed these changes to the natural progression of whatever mysterious ailment required her constant medication. They encouraged her to rest more, to avoid taxing her delicate mind with challenging reading or complex thoughts. This well-meaning advice only accelerated her decline, as the isolation and mental inactivity made her more dependent on laudanum for stimulation and comfort. The relationship between laudanum addiction and Victorian marriage patterns created additional layers of tragedy. Wives were expected to be cheerful, compliant, and sexually available to their husbands, regardless of their own feelings or physical state. Laudanum provided a chemical solution to this impossible expectation, allowing women to perform their marital duties while feeling emotionally detached from the experience. Some women began taking extra doses before intimate encounters, using opium to numb themselves to unwanted sexual contact. This use of laudanum as a coping mechanism for marital rape, though never acknowledged or discussed openly, became disturbingly common among Victorian women. The drug allowed them to dissociate from traumatic experiences while maintaining the appearance of wifely compliance. Husbands often interpreted their wives' passivity as contentment, never recognizing that they were essentially assaulting unconscious women. The pregnancy experiences of laudanum-addicted women were particularly horrific. Opium crosses the placental barrier readily, meaning that unborn children were exposed to the drug throughout their development. Babies born to addicted mothers often suffered from what doctors described as nervous conditions, or failure to thrive. Not understanding that these infants were experiencing withdrawal from drugs they had never consciously consumed, doctors would sometimes prescribe even more opium. Sarah Peaton, a merchant's wife in Manchester, gave birth to 4 children during her years of laudanum addiction. Each pregnancy became progressively more difficult as her tolerance increased and her health deteriorated. Her first child, conceived before her addiction began, was healthy and robust, but her subsequent children were born small and sickly, prone to crying fits and digestive problems that no amount of care seemed to cure. Sarah, desperate to soothe her suffering infants, would sometimes give them tiny doses of her own medicine, unknowingly perpetuating the cycle of addiction into the next generation. The pattern of infant laudanum use was so common that entire generations of Victorian children were exposed to opium from birth. Patent medicines specifically marketed for babies contained substantial amounts of the drug, and mothers routinely dosed fussy infants to keep them quiet and compliant. The most popular of these pediatric preparations was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained enough morphine to sedate a grown man. Advertisements for the product featured angelic children sleeping peacefully while their grateful mothers looked on with satisfaction. What the advertisements didn't mention was that babies given regular doses of these soothing syrups often died in their sleep, victims of respiratory depression caused by opiate overdose. As tolerance levels rose, some women began experimenting with more concentrated forms of opium. They would purchase raw opium from sailors returning from the East Indies, or seek out Chinese immigrants who could provide stronger preparations. These ventures into opium dens and foreign communities represented dramatic departures from Victorian respectability, but desperation had long since overcome social constraints. The opium dens of London's East End became unlikely refugees for upper-class women whose prescriptions no longer provided adequate relief. These establishments, originally serving Chinese workers and sailors, began catering to a surprising clientele of well-dressed ladies who arrived in closed carriages after dark. Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of a prominent judge, began frequenting such establishments in 1867 after her physician refused to increase her laudanum prescription. Disguised in plain clothing and accompanied by her most trusted servant, Elizabeth would slip through the back entrances of Limehouse opium houses, seeking the pure drug that her refined medicines could no longer provide. She would lie on silk cushions beside Chinese labourers and foreign seamen, all boundaries of class and race dissolved in their shared pursuit of opium dreams. These expeditions became increasingly dangerous as Elizabeth's addiction progressed. The concentrated opium available in the dens was far more potent than anything she had experienced through medical channels, and her tolerance calculations proved fatally inaccurate. On a fog-shrouded evening in November, Elizabeth consumed what she thought was her usual dose, only to slip into a coma from which she never awakened. Her body was discovered the next morning by a frantic servant, but the official cause of death was listed as heart failure to spare her family's reputation. The cover-ups surrounding laudanum deaths became an art form among Victorian families desperate to protect their social standing. Physicians were often complicit in these deceptions, understanding that accurate death certificates would destroy entire family legacies. They would examine obviously overdosed bodies and certify deaths as resulting from consumption, brain fever, or sudden cardiac arrest. Funeral services would emphasize the deceased's virtue and piety, with no mention of the bottles of laudanum found clutched in their lifeless hands. The elaborate funeral of Elizabeth Morrison became a template for how Victorian society processed these tragic deaths. Her father, Judge Morrison, delivered a moving eulogy about his daughter's delicate constitution and her brave struggle against nervous exhaustion. The mourners, dressed in their finest black silk, nodded solemnly as he spoke of Elizabeth's charitable works and gentle nature. None of them mentioned the empty laudanum bottles found throughout her bedroom, or the suspicious circumstances of her death in London's East End. This conspiracy of silence extended far beyond individual families. Newspapers of the era developed their own coded language for reporting laudanum deaths. They would describe women as succumbing to prolonged illnesses born with Christian fortitude, or nervous disorders, carefully avoiding any mention of the opium that had actually killed them. Obituaries praised the deceased's patience in bearing their suffering, their devotion to family, and their gracious acceptance of God's will. The true cause of their agony remained hidden beneath layers of euphemism and social propriety. Dr. William Hartley, a London physician who treated dozens of laudanum-addicted women during his career, kept private journals that revealed the staggering scope of the epidemic. His notes, discovered decades later, documented case after case of respectable women who had lost control of their medicine consumption. He wrote of Mrs. Catherine Wells, a banker's wife, who was taking 40 grains of laudanum daily by the time she sought his help. To put this in perspective, 2 grains was considered a therapeutic dose for severe pain. Catherine was consuming 20 times the recommended amount just to feel normal. Dr. Hartley's attempts to help these women were hampered by both medical ignorance and social constraints. He couldn't hospitalize respectable ladies alongside charity cases and criminals, yet treating them at home meant they retained access to the very substances destroying them. His suggested treatment plans read like exercises in futility, gradual reduction schedules that patients couldn't follow, moral lectures about willpower that ignored the physical reality of addiction, and recommendations for travel to distant climates, where patients simply found new sources for their drugs. The international nature of the opium trade meant that Victorian women could feed their addictions almost anywhere in the civilized world. Agnes Whitmore, fleeing her husband's growing suspicions about her laudanum use, accompanied her sister on an extended tour of European spas. She discovered that German apothecaries sold even stronger opium preparations than their English counterparts, and that Swiss sanitariums would provide unlimited quantities of the drug to wealthy patients seeking treatment for nervous conditions. Agnes spent 6 months moving from spa to spa, always claiming to need stronger medicine for her worsening condition. She would arrive at each new establishment appearing wan and suffering dramatically, describing symptoms that any physician would recognize as requiring opiate treatment. The European medical community, even more deferential to wealthy English ladies than their domestic counterparts, readily prescribed whatever Agnes requested, but the constant travel and increasing drug consumption began taking a visible toll. Agnes's letters home, initially cheerful accounts of scenic mountain views and therapeutic treatments, became increasingly erratic and confused. She would write the same news multiple times in a single letter, forget important family events, and describe conversations with people who didn't exist. Her handwriting, once elegant and precise, became shaky and barely legible. When Agnes finally returned to England, her transformation shocked even those who had known about her laudanum use. She appeared to have aged decades during her months abroad, her face gaunt and her movements unsteady. The religious community's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed deep contradictions within Victorian moral frameworks. While churches preached against the evils of alcohol and tobacco, they remained largely silent about patent medicines that were destroying their female parishioners. This selective blindness reflected both genuine ignorance about addiction and deliberate avoidance of issues that might challenge comfortable assumptions about feminine virtue. Reverend William Hartwell faced this moral dilemma directly when his own wife, Margaret, began exhibiting obvious signs of laudanum dependence. Margaret had started taking Dr. Morrison's nerve tonic after the birth of their youngest child, claiming it helped her maintain the energy needed for her extensive church duties. But Reverend Hartwell gradually noticed that his wife's periods of charitable enthusiasm alternated with episodes of withdrawn lethargy that seemed to coincide with her medicine schedule. As a man of God, Reverend Hartwell believed that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual failing that could be overcome through prayer and moral discipline. He spent hours counseling his wife about the importance of self-control and the dangers of relying on earthly substances rather than divine strength. But his theological approach to what was actually a medical condition only increased Margaret's shame and desperation. Margaret began hiding her medicine consumption from her husband, taking doses in the church vestry before services and keeping bottles concealed in her Bible case during pastoral visits. The secrecy required to maintain her addiction while fulfilling her role as a minister's wife created additional psychological pressure that accelerated her decline. When Margaret finally collapsed during a women's prayer meeting, convulsing and foaming at the mouth in front of the entire congregation, Reverend Hartwell was forced to confront the reality of his wife's condition. But even then, he interpreted her overdose as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical emergency, calling for prayer circles and fasting rather than medical intervention. Margaret survived that particular episode, but her public collapse had shattered the carefully maintained fiction of her virtue and piety. Congregation members began whispering about the minister's wife who had lost control of herself during worship, and several families started attending other churches to avoid the embarrassment of association with scandal. The religious community's inability to address addiction honestly forced many suffering women to choose between their faith and their health. They could confess their struggles and face condemnation as moral failures, or they could maintain their addictions in secret while participating in religious activities that emphasized the very self-control they had lost. Some women found refuge in religious communities that took more compassionate approaches to human weakness. The Society of Friends, known as Quakers, developed an early understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral problem, offering support and treatment rather than judgment. But these progressive religious groups represented small minorities within predominantly punitive theological frameworks. The economic pressures created by laudanum addiction often forced women into increasingly desperate measures to fund their drug purchases. As tolerance levels rose and required doses became more expensive, many women found themselves consuming significant portions of household budgets on medicine without their husband's knowledge. Constance Fairfax developed an elaborate system of financial deception to support her escalating laudanum consumption. She would purchase expensive household items from merchants who agreed to inflate their invoices, then return the goods for cash refunds that she used to buy medicine. She convinced tradespeople to bill her husband for services never rendered, keeping the payments for her own use. Most ingeniously, she began hosting charity fundraising events where she would skim donations intended for orphanages and hospitals. Constance's financial manipulations worked for nearly 2 years before her husband discovered discrepancies in their household accounts. By that time, she had embezzled hundreds of pounds from various sources, creating debts that threatened to destroy her family's social standing and financial security. When confronted with evidence of her theft, Constance broke down and confessed not only to the financial crimes, but to the laudanum addiction that had driven her to desperate measures. Her husband, a respected banker who had built his reputation on financial integrity, faced the impossible choice between exposing his wife's crimes and covering up behavior that violated everything he claimed to believe about honesty and moral responsibility. The family ultimately chose concealment over justice, repaying the stolen funds and fabricating explanations for the financial irregularities. Constance was quietly sent to a private sanatorium, where she could receive treatment away from public scrutiny. But the shame and stress of her exposure triggered a final overdose that ended her life within weeks of her admission. The pattern of financial crime driven by laudanum addiction was far more common than Victorian society ever acknowledged. Women who had never contemplated dishonesty found themselves stealing from their children's education funds, pawning family heirlooms, and manipulating household accounts to support drug habits they couldn't control. The shame associated with these crimes was often worse than the physical effects of the addiction itself. The domestic service industry became another hidden casualty of the laudanum epidemic, as household staff found themselves managing employers whose drug use created impossible working conditions. Servants were expected to maintain normal household routines while their mistresses existed in varying states of opiate intoxication, creating daily crises that required constant improvisation and discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, head housekeeper for the prominent Blackwood family, developed an intimate understanding of laudanum addiction through years of managing Lady Blackwood's increasingly erratic behaviour. Eleanor learned to recognise the signs that indicated when her mistress had taken too much medicine, when she needed assistance walking without falling, and when she should be left alone to avoid triggering paranoid episodes. The moral burden placed on servants like Eleanor was enormous and largely unacknowledged. They were required to enable their employers' addictions through purchasing medicines, concealing evidence of drug use from other family members, and maintaining household functions when their mistresses were too intoxicated to provide direction. Yet they were also expected to maintain absolute loyalty and discretion, never discussing their employers' conditions with anyone outside the household. Eleanor's detailed diaries, discovered decades after her death, provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of living with laudanum addiction. She described mornings when Lady Blackwood would be found unconscious in her sitting room, afternoons when she would mistake servants for deceased relatives, and evenings when she would become convinced that intruders were hiding throughout the house. The physical dangers posed by heavily medicated employers created constant anxiety for household staff, who understood they could be blamed for any accidents or incidents that occurred under their watch. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers developed survival strategies that would shape their approach to relationships and authority for the rest of their lives. They learned to function as amateur physicians, recognizing the difference between their mother's various states of intoxication and understanding when adult intervention might be necessary to prevent medical emergencies. Young Timothy Ashworth became expert at managing his mother's laudanum addiction by age 10, having learned through painful experience that his survival depended on accurately reading her condition and responding appropriately. When his mother had taken too much medicine, Timothy would help her to bed and monitor her breathing until the danger passed. When she was experiencing withdrawal, he would bring her tea and remain nearby to provide comfort during the worst symptoms. Timothy's childhood responsibilities included tasks that no child should have been asked to perform. He learned to forge his mother's handwriting to write excuses for missed social obligations, to lie convincingly to visitors about his mother's whereabouts, and to manage household finances when his mother was too impaired to handle money responsibly. Most tragically, he became skilled at hiding evidence of his mother's condition from his father, understanding instinctively that family stability depended on maintaining elaborate deceptions. The hypervigilance required for these responsibilities created lasting psychological changes that affected Timothy's development well into adulthood. He became unable to relax completely, always scanning his environment for signs of crisis or danger. He developed an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's emotional states, believing that he could prevent disasters through careful attention and appropriate intervention. The tragedy of laudanum addiction reached its darkest depths when examining the pharmaceutical industry's deliberate targeting of pregnant women and new mothers. Companies like Bayer and Park Davis developed specific marketing campaigns that portrayed opium-based medicines as essential for maternal health, claiming that expectant mothers who didn't use these preparations were endangering both themselves and their unborn children. Dr. Samuel Richardson's maternal cordial promised to ensure easy deliveries and healthy babies, while Mrs. Hartwell's nursing mother's friend guaranteed abundant milk production and calm dispositions. These products contained astronomical amounts of opium, often exceeding the concentrations found in medicines marketed to the general population. The manufacturers understood that pregnancy and childbirth created captive markets of women desperate for relief from physical and emotional suffering. Helena Blackwood discovered this truth during her fourth pregnancy in 1862. After 3 difficult births that had left her weakened and anxious, Helena's physician recommended Dr. Richardson's preparation to ensure a smoother delivery. The medicine seemed miraculous during her pregnancy, eliminating the nausea and emotional volatility that had plagued her previous experiences. Helena felt serene and confident, convinced that she had finally found the secret to comfortable motherhood. But when Helena's daughter was born, the infant exhibited strange behaviours that no one could explain. Little Margaret would scream for hours without apparent cause, her tiny body rigid with tension that nothing seemed to soothe. She refused to nurse properly, turning away from her mother's breast with what appeared to be distress. Most troubling of all, the baby seemed to experience episodes where she would shake uncontrollably, her face contorting as if in pain. The family physician attributed these symptoms to a nervous temperament inherited from Helena's delicate constitution. He recommended continuing the maternal cordial throughout the nursing period to ensure that Helena's milk would carry calming properties to her agitated infant. What he didn't understand was that baby Margaret was experiencing withdrawal from opium she had received through the placenta, and that continuing Helena's medication would only perpetuate the infant's addiction through breast milk. This tragic cycle repeated itself in nurseries across the civilized world, as entire families became unknowingly dependent on opium. Mothers would dose themselves to cope with the demands of childcare, inadvertently drugging their nursing infants. When these babies became fussy or difficult, mothers would increase their own medication, or begin giving the children direct doses of patent medicines specifically marketed for infant use. The international trade networks that supplied opium to Victorian consumers created opportunities for particularly unscrupulous operators to exploit addicted women. Smugglers and black market dealers recognized that wealthy ladies represented lucrative customers who would pay premium prices for reliable supplies of high-quality drugs. Captain James Morrison, a former East India Company officer, established a sophisticated distribution network that supplied laudanum to upper-class women throughout London and the surrounding counties. Morrison's operation was disguised as a legitimate import business, dealing in exotic spices and medicinal herbs, but his real profits came from the pure opium he smuggled in specially designed containers that escaped customs inspection. Morrison's customers included the wives of members of Parliament, prominent businessmen, and high-ranking military officers. He maintained detailed records of their purchases, using this information both to track their escalating consumption and to ensure their continued silence about his illegal activities. Women who attempted to reduce their purchases or seek alternative suppliers would receive anonymous letters, reminding them of the social consequences that would follow if their addiction became public knowledge. The blackmail aspect of Morrison's business model reflected the vulnerability of laudanum-addicted women to criminal exploitation. Their desperate need for reliable drug supplies, combined with their terror of social exposure, made them perfect victims for unscrupulous dealers who understood how to leverage shame and dependence for profit. Lady Margaret Ashworth became trapped in Morrison's web when her usual sources of laudanum proved inadequate for her escalating needs. Morrison promised to provide stronger preparations at reasonable prices, but gradually increased his charges while reducing the quality of his products. When Margaret protested, Morrison threatened to inform her husband about her purchases unless she agreed to recruit other customers from her social circle. Margaret found herself acting as Morrison's agent, introducing other addicted women to his services while receiving free supplies for her own use. The moral degradation of becoming a drug dealer while maintaining her facade as a respectable society matron accelerated Margaret's psychological deterioration and deepened her self-loathing. The Lord epidemic stands as a stark reminder that progress without compassion leads only to elegant destruction, and that the most dangerous poisons often come wrapped in the most beautiful packages. Hello and welcome. Tonight we're stepping into a time where being a queen meant wearing 10 pounds of brocade while silently enduring political chess matches where you were often the piece, not the player. Welcome to medieval royalty, where your crown is heavy, your smile is rehearsed. And yes, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's on the other side of this journey. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 13, maybe 14, and someone just told you you're getting married. You're a noble girl, maybe a princess, maybe the daughter of a minor king, and you're about to become a medieval queen. Romantic, right? No. This isn't love, it's politics through and through. Your future husband is chosen for what he can offer your father. Land, troops, a treaty, or maybe it's just an end to a blood feud that's been going on longer than you've been alive. Your opinion isn't just not required, it's not even considered. If you protest too much, you risk dishonouring your family, and you know how that ends. Spoiler, not well. You're packed off from your home with a procession of ox-drawn carts, dowry chests, and worried ladies-in-waiting who've been assigned to babysit you until the grave. Or worse, until your new court decides to swap them out for spies. Maybe you've met the king once, maybe not. Doesn't matter. You'll meet him again on your wedding day, under a canopy of incense and chanting monks in front of a crowd of strangers who can't wait to see if you cry. And you probably will, because this man isn't some dashing fairy tale prince. He's 35, grizzled from wars, maybe still married to someone else who's been conveniently locked in a convent. Or worse. Or he's a boy your age with just as little power and a court full of venomous old nobles using you both like dolls in a shadow play. Historically, this wasn't rare. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Louis VII of France at 15. She became Queen of France basically overnight. Her job, be beautiful, obedient, and give France an heir, in that exact order. Not that she obeyed any of it, by the way, but we'll get to her legendary rebellion later. Right now, your life is all about silks, sapphires, and suffocating responsibility. And the wedding? Let's not sugarcoat it. You walk down the nave in a gown that weighs more than your horse, embroidered with gold thread and lined in squirrel fur. Sounds luxurious until you realise medieval laundry was, inconsistent. You may look radiant, but you smell like beeswax, old lavender, and stress sweat. Everyone's watching. Everyone! The bishop, your future in-laws, the servants pressed against the back walls trying to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. After the vows and rings, maybe a crown if they're feeling generous. You're escorted to a room where, depending on how invasive the customs are, your first night with your husband might be witnessed. No, not metaphorically. There's an entire tradition in some courts of having noble witnesses observe the newlyweds being put to bed, and even a sheet check the next morning to prove the marriage was consummated. Sleep well. The weirdest part? Your family likely trained you for this moment. You were raised in a chamber near the women's quarters, taught to read just enough to recite psalms, trained in needlework and decorum. But no one told you how terrifying it would be to kneel beside a man who can literally sentence people to death and call him your beloved lord. You might not speak his language. You probably don't know what kind of ruler he is. And you're expected to share his bed, smile like it's an honour, and get to work on making babies immediately. The power imbalance is staggering. But here's the twist. Queens weren't always powerless. In fact, many wielded incredible soft power through influence, alliances, and religious networks. But in the beginning, as a teenager dropped into a foreign court with different food, strange customs, and possibly even hostile nobility, you're more decorative than decisive. And yet, there's something surreal about it too. You're handed a crown, draped in cloaks worth more than a farm, and referred to as Her Grace by people who a week ago didn't know you existed. Your name changes, your coat of arms is redrawn, your past absorbed into your husband's world. This isn't just a marriage, it's a rebranding. You're not a daughter anymore, you're property, carefully placed atop the chessboard of European dynasties. Sometimes you're lucky, maybe your husband is kind, maybe the court respects you, maybe you learn to speak the language, make allies, and even carve out a space of your own. But don't get too comfortable. Your womb is now a matter of state. Your first duty is to have a male heir, preferably yesterday. Everything else is just window dressing. One fringe fact, in some royal weddings, the bride was literally carried to bed in a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, complete with songs, jokes, and awkward nudging from older relatives. The entire court treated it like the grand finale of a banquet. Imagine that as a teenager. Scholars still debate whether queens were pawns or players in this system. Some insist they were nothing more than vessels for heirs and peace treaties. Others argue that, despite restrictions, they often held real sway, especially if they managed to outlive their husbands or raise powerful sons. But tonight, you're just a young queen sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, staring at tapestries you don't recognize, trying not to cry. And guess what? It only gets more complicated from here. The next morning, sunlight pours through stained glass windows you don't recognize, casting jewel-toned shadows across a stone floor that's colder than your nerves. You're awake far too early, muscles aching from the stiff ceremonial bedding, and already the court is bustling with whispered gossip and clipped footsteps. Why? Because today, your dowry becomes official. And let's be honest, no one in this castle cares more about you than they do about what you're worth. The dowry isn't just a polite thank you for taking you off your father's hands. It's a carefully calculated package of wealth, land, titles, and sometimes entire cities. You are a geopolitical transaction in pearls and velvet. It's possible your dowry was discussed for years before you even hit puberty. And now, with the marriage complete in the most awkward sense, the accounts are due. Clerks in itchy robes hunch over parchment, squabbling over exactly how many cows or manors equate to your hand in marriage. Some royal dowries were absolutely bonkers. Margaret of Denmark, for instance, brought the entire Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of hers. Imagine being so valuable that whole chunks of the North Sea came with your wedding vows. Meanwhile, in France or England, the dowry could include jewellery, spices, bolts of cloth, and thousands of gold coins. An actual line item might be 12 gowns embroidered with peacock feathers. And this stuff wasn't symbolic, it mattered. If the dowry fell short or was delayed, it could spark a war. Yep, a war over your missing embroidery thread. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Your value is now locked into this transaction. If your dowry was large and paid on time, congratulations, you're a prized political asset. If your father shortchanged your husband or reneged on promises, you're officially the most expensive disappointment in court. No pressure. But it gets trickier. The dowry isn't just a one-way street. There's also something called a dower, which is what your husband promises you in return, sort of a just-in-case he dies horribly in battle fund. It usually includes lands or income-producing properties that you'll inherit if you outlive him. Of course, whether you'll actually get those lands, well, that depends on your husband's mood, your popularity, and how many scheming in-laws want those assets for themselves. There's a fringe historical tidbit here that's kind of hilarious in a grim way. Some dowries were detailed down to the number of undergarments included. Like your father might have sent a full accounting of your trousseau, including how many linen shifts you brought, and whether they were laced with gold thread. Some of these inventories have survived, and yes, they are weirdly specific. It's like reading a medieval fashion hall on parchment. The moment this transactional dance is complete, you officially belong to your husband's household. Your loyalties shift instantly, whether your heart has or not. And here's where it gets wildly awkward. Sometimes your father and husband hate each other, like deeply, but that doesn't matter anymore. You have to play nice, stay neutral, and most importantly, produce heirs. That's the only part of the deal that can't be written on parchment, so everyone's watching, waiting to see if you start showing signs of pregnancy. Fast. Oh, and don't expect privacy. Courtiers love to speculate. There's even a term for the flurry of surveillance queens faced after their weddings, the queen's bloom. Everyone wants to know when you'll bloom into motherhood. If you sneeze at breakfast or skip a wine goblet, whispers swirl like storm clouds. Some queens even faked early pregnancies to buy themselves time. Others miscarried in secret just to avoid court humiliation. You might try to focus on something less overwhelming, like settling into your new chambers. But even that's fraught. Your rooms are richly decorated, yes, gilded wall panels, carved bedposts, rugs imported from Byzantium, but you're not alone in them, ever. Your ladies-in-waiting sleep nearby, servants shuffle in and out without knocking, and everything you say can and will be repeated. Still, you try to take control of what you can. Maybe you ask for your favourite psalter to be placed by your bedside. Maybe you commission a tapestry depicting your family crest to remind everyone, including yourself, where you came from. Little acts of self-assertion can go a long way, but you learn quickly. Don't overdo it. Being too proud is risky, especially if you're a foreign queen. People want you to be dignified, not defiant. Here's a scholarly debate that never quite gets settled. Were dowries empowering or dehumanizing? Some historians argue that because the dowry often came with land rights and income, it gave queens leverage within the royal household. Others counter that the whole system reduced women to literal price tags. You might find truth in both views. After all, you've got land and jewels, but also about as much autonomy as a decorative tablecloth. And then, of course, there's the awkward reality that you might be used again. If this marriage fails, say your husband dies suddenly or the alliance falls apart, you can be shipped off and married again, sometimes to someone even older or with fewer teeth. Your dowry might be renegotiated like a used goods exchange. The only thing more unstable than a political marriage is a second political marriage. Yay, but for now, you smile, sit upright at feasts, and pretend the sausages and honeyed almonds make it all feel normal. You clasp your goblet with elegant fingers and laugh politely at jokes you barely understand. Every gesture is watched, every misstep judged, every moment documented, sometimes literally in court records or chroniclers' scrolls, because you're no longer a person. You're a symbol, a treaty, a gilded link between two unstable kingdoms, and as exhausting as all that is, it's just the beginning. The first time you see the castle that's now your home, you expect something majestic. Maybe soaring towers, lush gardens, polished stone glowing in the afternoon light. What you get instead is something out of a chilly dream. Cold walls, grey skies, the air thick with damp moss and suspicion. The castle isn't built for comfort, it's built to withstand sieges, and now you live here. Congratulations, the arrival at court is theatre, make no mistake. The entire court turns out to greet you, though no one smiles too widely. Banners fly, trumpets blare, and children are scrubbed within an inch of their lives, just to stand in a muddy courtyard waving sprigs of rosemary. You ride in, stiff in the saddle, posture perfect. Your gown probably weighs 30 pounds, and underneath you're bracing against saddle sores and a cold wind that cuts through your silk-lined sleeves like a knife. But you can't flinch. Queens don't flinch. At the castle gates, your husband, or future husband, depending on how drawn out the wedding festivities are, greets you with ceremonial gestures, a kiss on the cheek, a quick touch of the hand if he's bold. Maybe he lifts your veil in front of the crowd, but you're already scanning the faces behind him. That's your real concern. Who's watching you with narrowed eyes? Who's smiling a little too much? Because the moment you cross that threshold, you're not just a guest. You're an intruder in someone else's world. The court is a hive of activity. Men in embroidered tunics bow stiffly. Women in heavy wimples exchange glances, and servants skitter like mice behind the scenes. You're introduced with all the usual pomp. Her Royal Grace, Queen of such and such, Lady of this and that. It takes a full 2 minutes just to say your title, but every word reminds everyone exactly what price you fetched. That title is sewn into your identity now, whether you like it or not. Inside, the place smells like burning tallow, wet stone, and whatever the kitchen is stewing for tonight's feast, which could be anything from spiced rabbit to eel pie. The walls are lined with tapestries that look warm but don't really help against the draught. Your rooms, what they call the Queen's apartments, are secluded enough to keep you from the general rabble, but not so private that gossip can't sneak in through the floorboards. And here's the kicker. You don't know anyone. Not really? Maybe your new mother-in-law, if she's still alive and hasn't been packed off to a nunnery. Maybe your ladies-in-waiting, if your father managed to send a few you trust. But most of the people around you? Strangers. Ambitious, gossipy, power-sniffing strangers. And you're a teenage queen with no allies, no experience, and no idea which fork to use for salted trout. A real-life example of this cold welcome. Anne of Bohemia, when she arrived in England to marry King Richard II, people openly mocked her dowry, calling it worthless. She didn't even speak English. She was thrust into a world where her new subjects expected miracles and instant charm, and she delivered neither, at least not at first. It took years for her to win people over. And you will try too. You'll smile politely at barons who ogle you, ask careful questions about local saints, compliment tapestries even when they're ugly. Everything is performance. And the worst part? The performance never ends. You're not allowed to sulk or snap or ask to go home, not unless you want to start a diplomatic incident. Oh, and you quickly realize that every step you take is being watched. Not metaphorically, literally. There are eyes in the walls, not magic, just very bored, very nosy servants who report to higher-ranking courtiers, who in turn feed information to the king's advisors, and eventually to the king himself. Did the queen eat her figs at breakfast? Did she talk too long with the Spanish envoy? Did she wear blue on a feast day? All noted, all discussed in hushed tones over spiced wine. But let's zoom in on the servants for a moment, because this is where things get weird. Some are devoted, some resentful, and some are just there. One might be a peasant girl who's never left her village before being promoted to chambermaid. Another could be the bastard daughter of a noble family with nowhere else to go. And a few, full-on spies. Some sent by your own family, some by your enemies, and some just nosy opportunists with good ears and long memories. The fringe fact here, in some medieval courts, queens were expected to keep their own miniature household within the larger royal household. Think of it like a secret club with its own budget, hierarchy and drama. You manage your own maids, scribes, cooks and confessor. Sounds empowering, until you realize any one of them might betray you the moment it benefits someone higher up the chain. Meanwhile, your new subjects are watching too, and they have opinions. If you're from a foreign land, you're immediately suspected of trying to corrupt the court with foreign ideas, or worse, foreign fashions. They whisper that you bring omens, that your accent means your prayers don't count, that your foreign ways are a sign of secret sin. Even if you're kind and generous, rumours cling to you like damp wool. This brings us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were foreign queens more vulnerable or more powerful because of their outsider status? Some say they had fewer political allies and were easy scapegoats. Others argue that their unique background gave them a rare independence from local factions. In your case, it just feels like being isolated in a room full of people who all know something you don't. But still, you settle in. You memorize names. You learn which corners of the castle stay warmest at night. You start eating like the locals, sort of. You practice curtsies in front of the looking-glass until your knees ache. And slowly, very slowly, the court begins to see you, not just as the new queen, but as their queen. Not that this makes things easier. In fact, it just means the real games are about to begin. Night falls heavy in the stone corridors of your new home, and while the day has been full of handshakes, veiled compliments, and trying not to trip over your own embroidery, tonight is something else entirely. Tonight is about duty, or, depending on which court gossip you listen to, spectacle. You're expected to do more than share a bed. You're expected to seal the marriage in a way that leaves no doubt, no legal loopholes, and no "we'll wait and see." Tonight, you're expected to consummate your union, and in some medieval courts, that expectation doesn't stop at the bedroom door. You've heard the whispers, of course. Some kingdoms go all in on the witnessed bedding ceremony. A crowd escorts you and your husband to the marriage bed with jokes, songs, and awkward blessings. Think of it as a medieval conga line, except it ends with you being undressed by your ladies while everyone else stands around pretending not to stare. In some places, the bedding itself was attended, though mercifully not always literally witnessed. Instead, the next morning, sheets were displayed, or midwives and matrons might be called to check for certain, signs of activity. You lie in bed, heart-pounding, draped in linens that smell like damp rosewater, and centuries of awkward history. Your husband lies beside you, possibly more nervous than you are, though he'd rather be thrown to the wolves than admit it. Whether he's gentle or cold, or fumbling or practiced, you're still a teenager, and no amount of training or advice can prepare you for the reality of being expected to perform intimacy with someone who was a stranger last week. This is not a honeymoon. It's a civic ritual, and while it's cloaked in lace and candles, it's ultimately about succession and legitimacy, not your feelings. This is what queens were trained for, even if no one said it out loud. You may have spent years learning courtly manners, religious verses, how to direct a household, but all of it leads to this: making sure the marriage is binding and productive. It's a terrifyingly thin line between beloved queen and political failure. You wake up the next morning under that same weight. You're a wife now, a potential mother, a state investment that needs to yield results. And people start watching you differently. The same courtiers who nodded politely yesterday now glance at your stomach when you pass, eyes flicking down as if your womb might announce its intentions by breakfast. Your maids whisper more, the ladies-in-waiting act more possessive, and your husband, well, he's probably off hawking or hunting, because the deed is done, and his role, at least for now, is considered fulfilled. You might not even be the only woman in his life. Medieval kings were not known for monogamy. Some had official mistresses, others just a rotating list of favourites, many of whom lived under the same roof. In some courts, the queen was expected to tolerate it. Open jealousy was not elegant. You're meant to be serene, divine, and above it all, even if your heart's breaking or your blood's boiling. And yet, some queens navigated this chaos with surprising agency. Take Isabella of France, for instance. Married to England's Edward II, who famously preferred the company of a certain male favourite, Isabella endured years of being sidelined before eventually leading a rebellion against her husband. Yep, the Queen led an actual coup. So while the first night might feel like the beginning of a lifetime of submission, that's not always how the story ends. But in this moment, that feels very far away. The court isn't done with you yet. After the marriage comes the public confirmation of your new role. You might be paraded through the streets in a gilded carriage, petals thrown at your feet, people cheering as if you've already delivered twins and saved the kingdom from plague. It's all part of the illusion. Queens aren't just figureheads. They're symbols of divine blessing. Your beauty, your poise, your fertility, all seen as signs that God favours the realm. No pressure. A fringe fact worth noting. In some traditions, a special cake or spiced bread was served the day after the wedding, and everyone would toast to your hypothetical future children. Sometimes there were even fertility symbols baked into the crust, because what's more charming than cutting into a cake and finding a little golden baby charm staring up at you? But don't be fooled. Under all this pomp lies a harsh truth. If you don't get pregnant quickly, or worse, if you miscarry, your popularity will nosedive. People will blame your body, your foreign blood, your sins, your lack of piety. Never mind that medieval medicine was basically guesswork with leeches. Never mind that men also contribute half of that equation. You are the queen, and therefore the breeding machine. The pressure is constant and deafening. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how much say medieval queens had over their own marital beds. Some argue that queens could negotiate bedroom dynamics, especially if they were politically savvy or came from powerful families. Others believe queens were largely powerless, their consent a non-issue in legal and religious eyes. What we do know is that many queens found clever ways to control what they could: timing, influence over household staff, and eventually guidance over their children's futures. But at this stage, you're mostly along for the ride, so you do what you must. You perfect your smile. You begin keeping a private journal, perhaps, or whispering thoughts into the ears of trusted maids, though trust is always relative. You go to mass. You attend court. You send letters to your mother back home if the scribes allow it. You start planning for what comes next, not just pregnancy, but survival. And survival, you're starting to realize, means more than staying alive. It means staying useful, charming, obedient, fertile, unthreatening, but also clever, resilient, patient. You're walking a tightrope wrapped in gold thread, and every. Morning, as the bells toll across the grey courtyard and your reflection flickers in a polished copper mirror, you ask yourself quietly, how long can I keep this up? It starts with a flutter, just a whisper of nausea when you rise, a slight tightening in your chest when the morning porridge hits your stomach the wrong way. Your maid notices before you do, narrowing her eyes as she helps lace your gown a little looser. The word spreads faster than you'd think. The queen is changing. Couriers exchange looks. The cook starts preparing lighter foods. A physician is summoned without you even asking. No one says the word directly, not yet. But you already know what they're hoping for. You're pregnant. Maybe. And just like that, you're not just a wife anymore. You're the womb of the realm. You've gone from ornamental to essential. The Queen's job, your job, is finally happening. And while on the surface there's joy, gifts, blessings, and ceremonial prayers, underneath it all is the sound of chairs being pulled closer to the throne. Because once you're carrying an heir, your power shifts just a little, but enough for people to start calculating how long they'll have to wait for a new king, or if you're really lucky, a queen mother. Pregnancy in medieval times is terrifying. There are no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no real understanding of germs or what a uterus actually looks like. You're not so much cared for as you are monitored, watched like a relic on the verge of cracking. The royal physicians poke and prod, feeling your pulse, measuring your belly with ribbons, muttering things in Latin while your ladies-in-waiting line up cloths soaked in lavender and rosemary. Some of the herbs help, some probably don't, some, if the dose is wrong, might even kill you. And yet, you go through the motions, trying to appear serene. You attend Mass every morning, nodding piously while the priest talks about the Virgin Mary and the miracle of life. That's the image they want from you. Holy Mother, chosen vessel, serene goddess of impending motherhood. But inside, you're a 17-year-old girl with lower back pain, a constant headache, and zero control over what's happening to your body. Every kick from inside your belly is both thrilling and terrifying. If it's a boy, you win the game. If it's a girl, you smile politely and pretend everyone's not secretly disappointed. And if the child is stillborn or you die in labour, well, then you'll be remembered in ballads as a tragic heroine, which is cold comfort, to be honest. By your 7th month, the palace begins to quiet down. Your husband grows more cautious. Visitors are shushed. Loud noises are forbidden near your chambers. The court is holding its collective breath. Midwives are brought in from far and wide, some traditional, some trained by monks, all quietly panicking beneath their calm smiles, because childbirth in the Middle Ages is a gamble with weighted dice. Even queens die screaming in childbed, probably especially queens. The pressure is higher, the gossip sharper, the risks enormous. And when the labour finally begins, the world shrinks. You're taken to a darkened room, windows covered, icons of saints propped up all around you. Candles flicker along the walls, shadows dancing like anxious angels. The room becomes what they call a lying-in chamber, sealed against bad spirits. It's hot, crowded, and thick with the smell of burning herbs and fear. You scream, of course you do. There's no pain relief, just grit and groan and chant and pray. The women around you, your ladies, the midwives, maybe even a few noble women, offer comfort, or at least try to. Some hold your hands, one might whisper a prayer in your ear over and over like a lullaby. But you're alone in this, really. Completely, utterly alone in your pain. Hours pass, maybe days. You lose track. The world becomes a blur of heat and agony and tightening pressure. You scream until your voice breaks. You pass out and come to. You think you hear someone say, "It's crowning," but it could just as easily be the last prayer you'll ever hear. And then, if you're lucky, a cry, a new voice, raw and angry, slicing through the candle smoke. A midwife lifts the child high, announces the sex with trembling reverence. "A boy," she says, or maybe a girl. And the court outside erupts accordingly. You don't even see the baby at first. Oh, you're too exhausted, too bloody, too shattered to sit up. Then someone presses the infant into your arms eventually, and for a second, a fleeting, golden, hallowed second, you feel joy. Pure, unfiltered joy. It's yours. This tiny, squirming person is yours. And then you remember, he doesn't really belong to you. He belongs to the kingdom. If it's a son, he's the heir, and your value skyrockets overnight. You're no longer just the queen, you're the mother of the future, a living insurance policy against succession wars. Your rooms fill with gifts, your name is sung in churches, and suddenly everyone wants your opinion on nursery arrangements, on treaties, on what colour robe the baby should wear for his first court appearance. If it's a girl, The congratulations are still there, but lighter, softer. A courtier might mention how daughters make wonderful bargaining chips for future marriages. Another might remind you that queens bear many children, and there's always next time. The fringe truth. Sometimes, if the queen gave birth to a boy, coins were minted within hours. Tiny, hastily stamped medallions that said, "This realm has an heir. All is well." If you gave birth to a girl, well, no coins. Maybe a feast if you were lucky. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did childbirth increase a queen's political power or trap her further? Some argue that motherhood granted queens influence, control over the royal nursery, a seat at the regency table if the king died. Others point out that it made queens more vulnerable, exposed to dangerous childbirths over and over again, reduced to walking cradles whose usefulness hinged on the health of their offspring. The answer, as always, depends on who you were, where you ruled, and how lucky your body was. You're bundled up in clean linen now, propped on pillows, your skin still pale and waxy, but the baby is breathing. You're breathing. The bells are ringing across the city, the kingdom rejoices. And you close your eyes and try to forget that this is only the first round. You've survived childbirth. That alone makes you something of a miracle. Now, as the days blend into a haze of damp linen, soft lullabies and sharp pelvic pain, you begin to settle into your new role. Not just as queen, not just as wife, but as something far more exhausting. Royal Mother. And with that title comes another shift, one that has less to do with survival and more to do with presentation. You can barely sit upright, but already the court expects you to begin looking the part again. And looking the part, as it turns out, is a full-time job. Your wardrobe becomes a stage, and every layer you put on is political. Every colour, every hem, every jewel carries a message. I am regal. I am fertile. I am strong. But more than anything else, it screams, I am worth obeying. You're no longer dressing to impress a husband. You're dressing to remind the kingdom that you belong here. That you have produced proof of your power in the form of a living, breathing heir. You're not to be dismissed, ignored, or replaced. Not yet, anyway. In the royal wardrobe, there's no such thing as casual. There's only layers: chemise, surcoat, gown, overgown, cloak, silk, velvet, fur, embroidery so fine it looks like lace, stitched with real gold thread, jewels sewn directly into sleeves. You don't wear your wealth. You drag it behind you, sewn into the hem and clinging to your wrists. Your crown alone could buy a small town and still have change, left over for a cathedral bell. And yet, underneath it all, you itch. The brocade is stiff. The pearls rub your collarbone raw. Some of the fur lining smells like damp cellar, especially in winter when nothing dries properly. You long for soft linen shifts, for bare feet on warm stones, for a moment without corsetry and pins. But queens don't get comfort. They get presents. Now, here's the tricky bit. You don't actually choose your wardrobe. Not entirely. A royal tailor does that, so does your chamberlain. And sometimes, just for fun, your mother-in-law weighs in. Your body is essentially on loan to the crown, and so is the fabric that wraps it. If a foreign ambassador visits, they'll expect you to wear a particular colour, perhaps blue to signify purity, or red to evoke power. If it's Easter, your garments will be stitched with lilies and crosses. If it's Advent, out comes the dark velvet and silver thread. Every season is a costume change. Historical tidbit: Queen Isabella of Castile's wardrobe accounts were meticulously kept, detailing every gown, every fur trim, every jewel. These records show how deeply intertwined royal fashion was with political messaging and national identity. So, as you stand there, weighted down by layers of silk and expectation, you understand that your appearance is a language in itself. It speaks of power, of tradition, of the continuation of a dynasty. And you, the young woman underneath it all, are merely the messenger. What do you think was the most challenging aspect of being a medieval queen?